recorded.
I do. Is that a better way to say it?
All right, welcome everyone to our first Deeper Learning Details series, where in this series, working with the What School Could Be Academy, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the actual practices of getting this deeper learning work done. And tonight, we're super excited to be joined by a couple of the long-term leaders of Kettle Moraine School District in Wisconsin, who have been working on building out a variety of things inside of Kettle Moraine. And I'm sure we'll touch on several of those as we go along tonight, but tonight going to focus a little bit more specifically on their portrait of a graduate and how that sort of serves as an anchor to the work that has been going on. So that's what we'll be up to tonight. We are joined by Theresa Ewald, who is the assistant superintendent and has been along for this journey for a long time in Kettle Moraine, and by Dahm, who is the director of elementary education, wearer of many hats, including instructional coaching and like helping build out a lot of PD, I think, in the past. And so both of them really have deep background in this. So Laura or Theresa, anything else on your own background we need to say before we jump into some questions?
No, that sounds great, Justin. Long time is code for old, so I appreciate that.
See, there's some things we need to work on. Improve our language a little there.
It's all great.
I'm with you. Okay, so I'm going to actually, Jason, I think share screen and go to the portrait of the graduate and pull it up just to give everyone a sense of what we're talking about. If you want to like help dive into some of our first questions.
Yeah, you bet. Well, now that we are on the record, I have to ask again, do you all both assent to having this recorded and share with the What School Could Be, as well as pulling out the data for the next book project?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, so talk to us a little bit about your efforts with the portrait of a graduate. So can you tell us the listeners a little bit of a summary about what all this is and what it looks like?
Sure.
Justin, you're sharing the wrong screen.
Your calendar looks great. Yeah.
Yeah, you look very busy.
There you go. That's the story of my life right there, Justin. Spent the last 2 years on Zoom and it's still tricky.
Yeah.
While you're getting that rolling, I can tell you a little bit about our history and how our portrait came to be. We started working on it actually years after we were really immersed in the personalized learning and talking about competency-based world. And so it was about 2016-17, that school year is when we began the development of our graduate profile that you see here on the screen. And what's on the profile I think is amazing, but to be honest, what I'm probably most excited about and just proud of our learning community is the process we used to put it together, which just included a really strong process of every stakeholder group, multiple feedback loops. Of note, I think, is that the first conversation and iteration of what you see on here came from a group that was students and teachers, and we had twice as many students on that group as we had teachers. And I think that speaks to one of our core values. And I think when people are building a portrait of a grad or a profile of a grad, you need to be, your core values of your organization need to shine through on that. Like that to me feels like a core piece. So that was pretty exciting. For us, it was kind of a natural next step. Our board for decades has had 3 pillars that they organize around: academic achievement, citizenship, and personal development. And when you think about those 3 pillars, it speaks to the portrait of a grad and what is on that portrait. So it's not just about your ACT score that suggests you're college ready. So our board had had that charge for a long time. Additionally, we have 4 high schools in our district, and we were seeking to find ways that those 4 schools had some commonalities. Like, what about a Kettle Moraine graduate was unifying, even though we have 4 different graduation opportunities from 4 different high schools. And I just think that was really exciting. We used our business community, our parents, our students, our school board, graduates. We have some post-secondary partnerships here in the state. And, you know, in Wisconsin, we have a really strong state university system. So all of those stakeholders gave feedback to help build the portrait. And also Laura can probably speak to this more eloquently than I can, is that it wasn't just a high school project, right? So even just the title, Portrait of a Grad, or Profile of a Grad, or whatever, everybody calls it something a little different, kind of suggests high school, you know. And the one thing that we know is that a graduate is not made in 4 years or their last year, right? So our kindergarten teachers are beginning to make graduates, and we believe that wholly and totally. And so maybe Laura, you could talk a little bit about the lens of even our elementary schools in that process.
So this is a district-wide initiative that you all initiated. So the same portrait for all grades.
Yeah, and I'm going to even push further than that, Jason. I like to think about it as a community initiative. And you know, other people talk about their portrait as a commitment to their kids. I think it's a commitment to our community, our families, our kids. This is our commitment. And when done right, everybody buys into that commitment, right? Because the other thing we believe is, you know, we're amazing in Kettle Moraine and our teachers are amazing, and we're not the only teachers in a child's life. And so we want to wrap everyone around that mission.
And I think echoing Theresa's sentiment, you know, our board has been pretty clear for a very long time that academic excellence is defined as not only that academic achievement, but also the citizenship and personal development. And that's really hard because for a long time, all that our board was talking about, all that was being presented at board meetings, all that's talked about in the paper and the state report card and things like that are those academic indicators. And so we really took it as the opportunity to say, we have to tell our own story. And if that's only 1/3 of what our board defines as you know, their metric for what a student in Kettle Moraine should experience and the outcome of a student in Kettle Moraine, we need to lean in on that and really be able to say, we do have an answer to the citizenship and personal development parts of our success criteria.
And I think too, it goes to the point of, you know, I push on our teachers because I feel like educators as a whole can talk out of both sides of their mouth, right? So like complain incessantly about the over reliance on judging us based on a standardized test score, right? You step any teacher, principal, anybody, and they complain about that. At the same time, when you do well, it's all they want to talk about is how great they just did on the standardized test. So it's like, okay, crew, we're in charge of our story. And if we don't tell a story that's better equipped to tell really what we're about, someone will tell our story for us, right? So we got to take charge of what we really believe.
So do you think that your all's process for developing this portrait of a graduate was different than other schools?
I've had some experience across the country of people developing theirs. Yes. So I'm going to say yes at times, right? So I've worked with the district where the 6th district office people like Laura and I and our colleagues sat in a room in summer and made it, right? I've worked with a district west of here. I won't say where, but they're high school teachers and got so narrow that the teachers of seniors, right, made the graduate profile. So I've seen it done that way. And I've also seen it done really, really well, similar to how I feel ours has been done with a lot of community input. And a lot of times I've seen that done with the help of outside consultants so that the people internally could be part of the process rather than running the process.
So can we, go ahead, Laura.
I was just gonna say, I think from the onset, you know, we were very keen and intentional to say, like, we don't want this to just become a poster in the hallway. Like, we don't want to go through all this work and all of the seeking feedback from stakeholders and really having student input and voice in this to just have it
So you open the door to it, and I want to go down that road a little bit, because we're very curious about the leadership moments. So you all had a history of personalized learning and then engaged this portrait of a graduate process. What I'm curious about is the challenges that might have existed in that space, any ideas that you scratched along the way. Like, you know, we're sort of probing for some insight into how this process went for you all and where the hard parts were that leaders had to push through in the process.
So one thing I will, just for clarification purposes, and this might make us really different than other places based on my experience, which is that we don't ever have finished documents in Kettle Moraine. And that can make people simultaneously crazy and assured, right? And so I think there were parts where we got a little stuck, usually frankly based on semantics, more about the exact words. But just saying to people, everything's a draft. Like we are right now in the process. 2 weekends ago, we brought 100 community members together to relook at our profile and talk about building out a continuum for it. It's constantly revisited. And you know, let's think about our last 24 months. So some people's portrait of a grad, now's a good time to say, is this still real? And do we have data, which I say stories and experiences are data? Do we have data that would suggest these things on our portrait are what our most successful learners, the kids who are most successful in the last 24 months had? Or as our reality changed, right? I just had a conversation this week with another school district, and they don't have anything on their portrait about like flexibility and resiliency. And then, you know, hello, what have we been doing? So it's a time to revisit. So I think a misstep people can make is like, this is it, concrete, you know, chip it into some stone next to the football stadium. That to me is a problem. So that it's always kind of a changing document.
So you talked about outside consultants. Who was there like a leadership team that was trying to bring this thing through? Was it the product of a single individual? I mean, I know there was a lot of community conversations, but like, what was the driving force to go from nothing to something?
It was definitely our superintendent and our leadership team that spearheaded it. But we have a really ingrained distributed leadership model. And so our previous superintendent, who just retired, as you guys know, there were times when she would bring ideas forward. And I know in other districts, if a superintendent says it, it's now law. Well, that's not really how things roll in Kettle Moraine. There's lots of opportunity to tell the leaders, I think this is a bad idea, a crazy idea, or what about this for part of the idea? So I do recall her bringing it forward, but I know the process and definitely the product was massaged by many.
Did Pat, being the past superintendent, does she have to sell this idea of coming up with an organic stakeholder-run graduate profile, or did that just seem natural to the culture at Kettle Moraine?
I think we were asking some of those questions already before we even had the outcome of a profile of a graduate, merely because we had a system with micro schools or multiple schools on one campus that really was kind of how we were working to how to define what we were to the community, to say, we do have unique opportunities. You can play all on the same football team. You can all be in the same spring musical. You can all be in robotics club, but during the day, you're in one of these 4 schools of choice, really, on the same campus. And so for some parents, it wasn't a big deal to wrap their heads around. And for other parents, it was just like really difficult to explain and understand how you could learn through a specific pedagogy or path during the day, but still have that entire high school experience that, we traditionally think of when we think of high school experiences. And so for us, it was like, how do we honor that the experiences are very unique and they're very maybe driven by a specific focus or a specific learning outcome, and yet say, regardless of which of these 4 schools you go to, our diploma has merit, and this is what it means to graduate from a KM school. So I think it was a bit of like trying to determine how could we, when you think of like a realtor who's selling houses and having people come in and say like, well, tell us about the high school. Well, which one of the high schools? Really giving some talking points to say, regardless of which school you choose in Kettle Moraine, here is kind of what our profile is of the outcome of that graduate.
And further, when I think about the flip of that, our elementary and middle school teachers are not working to get a kid ready for our performing arts high school or our kid ready for our health science high school, because, they're in 3rd grade. So, but they are getting kids ready for those pieces of the profile so that no matter what a learner chooses, what path they take, they've got those essential skills, and that those skills aren't just about next year. They're about all life, right?
And you used a lot of the big C, like if Tony Wagner, who joined us at the first Academy Day, he'd love the big C words in there. But then it's these sub definitions really bring things out into more detail. And so while the big C words are there, I'm guessing those sub definitions were the part that really came more from scratch from the district. But I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think what it was the descriptions came, and then the descriptions were what people spent most of their time on. And the words were the categorization of the descriptors and groups, right? So it was more of an emerging up than giving it a label and describing the label.
Well, I've gone through this process with many schools in Kentucky, and I think that's a uniqueness of your approach.
Yeah.
Most start with the big ideas and then try to build out the subdomains. But you all going from more of the descriptors then to, okay, so what's the big idea that captures this? I think that's probably a really good takeaway for future.
Sure. Well, the guiding question was, what does a successful Kettle Moraine graduate look like, sound like, feel like, right? So it's starting with the evidence. So, because everybody in the room, every parent thought, well, I know a successful graduate when I see it, and so we were like, well, great, tell us what that looks like. What, and that in those descriptions of what a successful grad looks like, sounds like, feels like, themes emerged: collaboration, engaged citizen, and so on.
So I want to get back around to evidence and assessment, but I'm curious, we got Laura, I'm guessing in 2017, you probably not elementary director at that point. And so instructional coaching kind of role probably. So this new document hits the district. What is sort of that initial wave of uptake, particularly for you at the elementary level more, because as Theresa was saying, like a lot of times these are very high school types of documents.
Yeah, I was teaching 4th and 5th grade at the time and directing a small charter school. And I would say for us, it was kind of an interesting, synergy, I guess, of we already at the elementary were really looking for kind of moving away from some ingrained PBIS phrasing of be kind, be safe, do your job, or be kind, be safe, be responsible, and really trying to wrestle with how do we help our elementary kids really understand more of like the habits and dispositions that we want them to have, not just kind of that check yes, no criteria. And so we had embarked probably 3 or 4 years prior to that into Costa and Kalik's framework of habits of mind, which there are 16 in their research, and that we felt was way too many for elementary students, especially learning the vocabulary at its base. So we started with anywhere between 4 and 8 that we worked to adopt both within my school. And then as we kind of started to say like, wow, we're seeing some great traction with this and getting some good feedback, that started to filter out to our other elementary schools. We did a variety of ways to engage parents in that, some book studies around the Habits of Mind framework. And so we were already kind of, as you look at on the graduate profile, like the yellow banners that say, you know, continuous learner, communicator, collaborator, we at the elementary felt like, well, before they can get to that, like we need to help them understand some dispositions and habits that would fall underneath those banners. So things like striving for accuracy or thinking flexibly or managing impulsivity. So that was kind of the work that was going on at the elementary. So it sort of was like, well, this is kind of a good fit because we can see how these 3 habits would fit under the communicator banner, or these 3 habits would fit under the collaborator banner. And so we felt like we were already kind of equipping kids with not only the vocabulary, but also the experience. And that came in a variety of ways. You know, I wouldn't say that we've arrived in the best way to collect evidence on that or have students really own and goal set their growth around that, but we've come a tremendous, I mean, it really is in the water of the conversation with kids and between learners and teachers at that elementary level. And so it was sort of like, we can very clearly see how this work that we're doing here kind of fits into the profile of a graduate as they are, you know, coming beyond elementary into 9-12.
So you all started with those habits of mind. That's the Costa and Kalik's 16 habits of mind. And then you worked up to the domains. I could see where a lot of schools might want to start looking at what other schools are doing as far as a graduate profile and start there. I know you all said you didn't start at the top, you went bottom up, but did you lean on other profiles in your search for your ideal profile, or did you keep it all organic and never the twain shall meet?
We looked at some others. To be honest, there weren't a ton out there at that time. So I feel like we had really less than a half dozen examples that we had found. And one of the exercises we did, not with all the stakeholder groups, but more of a leadership team, is kind of plus minus delta some of what we saw, you know. And there's not huge differences between them. I don't think the difference is in what is produced. I think the difference is how it's used. And that we, once we kind of got there in our heads that it's really about that, that helps us direct our energy.
And just while we're trying to quick chime in, I think 2017, that's exactly right. Or you were even probably in front of that 2016 while this was all probably being developing, right? And so that game has changed a lot, though. This was really at that point being pushed a lot by Ed Leader 21, who's now Battelle for Kids. So for districts that are just wanting to get started with it, over in the chat is portraitofagraduate.org, where you can go do that same thing that Theresa just laid out, which is like go critique a bunch of others, but don't necessarily follow a single pathway out there. All right, sorry, just chiming in, little tidbits along the way. All right, Jason, back to regularly scheduled programming.
Yeah, Theresa, you started to go into there until Justin's so good at the history, talking about how this profile is changing the experiences for some of your stakeholders. So how has this profile changed your experiences for kids, for teachers, for parents and leaders? Can you talk to that?
Sure, and I'll say that it's unevenly experienced. So one of the best things about our district is that kids have lots of choices of small schools. One of the trickiest things about leading our district is that we have all these little small schools. And so what we believe is that when educators and kids are on smaller teams where they have agency and freedom to try things, we're all better, right? So there's an incredible capacity for risk taking and, you know, just throw it up against the wall and see what sticks. And if it doesn't stick, fine, no one's in trouble, you know, whatever, move on. So because of that, it's been unevenly practiced or ingrained, perhaps, to the point of probably our most mature, personalized, competency-based environment. One of our high schools is at the point of they've created descriptors around what is quote unquote proficient. They're badging kids and thinking about how can those badges appear in a meaningful way on a transcript. Like that's amazing, right? That's amazing to me. I've been doing this for 29 years. Who would have ever thought? This is amazing. All the way to our largest high school environment, who's still working to, and they're the least mature when it comes to personalized competency based. They're like, what does this exactly mean? What ones am I responsible for all of them as a teacher? What does that look like? You know, and so it's unevenly applied, but I'm super comfortable with that because otherwise, if everybody's moving at the same pace and waiting for Theresa and Laura to say how it's going to roll, that's a bad plan. Because as talented as Laura is, she doesn't have all the answers. So we need to try things and see what works and then spread that across our teachers. So I think it's this experimentation and allowing for some epic fails and being comfortable with that go slow to go fast kind of thing.
So how is the experience different for parents as well? And Laura, I'm sorry, I just cut you off.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, the parent part is where maybe we could have done better. And I feel like that's I could answer that to everything. Part of it right now is our political environment, right? So my measure of that is there just seems to be a lack of trust from some of our parents, our vocal minority, around, well, you name it, they're opposed to it. So to them, it feels new, fluffy, you know, and they question it. So that's an area we need to do more with. One thing we've learned is if it's Theresa and Laura talking about it at the board meeting, it's not as well accepted as if it's little Johnny coming home and talking about it. So we're trying to make that happen.
I think at the onset too, I mean, we as a public institution, I mean, really owned the driving creation of this. And I think we lived that for a few years and definitely now are in more of a place. And I think we always realize this and believe that, but like now more than ever post-COVID of feeling, or still in COVID, we're not, I don't think we'll ever be post-COVID. But being in a place where we don't want all of the experiences that a student can gain, artifacts and evidence for these attributes to be at school. It really should be, I mean, if you really are a portrait of a graduate, it should be bigger than just what you do between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. And so we are now in a way, or have an opportunity to really think about how do we engage maybe that's an opportunity to engage our parents in a way that we can show that that their student can be valued for the work that they're doing outside of the school day.
So you both opened the door a little bit, and I'm just sort of teeing up the whole audience too that I'm about to go super deep because I am curious about competencies and assessment, and you all have some of that going on. So we want to sort of see how that unpacks. Then we'll broaden back out to some bigger leadership questions and then take audience questions. Okay, so we'll take this one real deep dive into like assessment for a minute, and then we'll find our way back out of this. But both of you sort of raised in different ways that the portrait of a graduate has to link somehow to evidence and assessment. From one high school who clearly is starting to really link these pieces together, including all the way to mastery transcript, which we doing a little homework in advance. If you're a mastery transcript district, and those competencies that live in a portrait of a graduate could very easily translate into a mastery transcript. So that's one. And then also hear you, Laura, a little bit talking about gathering artifacts to speak to competencies, which really rings to me like that all links together back to this portrait of a graduate. So if you're both willing to unpack that a little bit, I think that'd be super useful.
Yeah, so just for clarification purposes, Justin, we have one of our 4 high schools as a mastery transcript high school, not all 4 of our high schools. So again, to my previous point, this is something they're passionate about and have the leadership wanting to run with. And I'm like, cool, do that. So they're gonna inform us all, right? But this to me is the most exciting work we're doing this year, which is collaboratively with a lot of stakeholders, building continua for each of the elements, the 6 elements on the profile, so that a learner can watch themselves grow across time. So they start in 4-year-old kindergarten and they watch themselves grow over the years through 12th grade in each of those areas. And so we're collaboratively defining that continuum. And to Laura's point, I really am hoping and excited and gonna do what I can with the process to push that those descriptors are not school dependent, so that a learner can demonstrate them in multiple areas, right? So anybody who's on here and listening who has their own children sees some of these things at home, right? Or probably notices the lack of them more than sees the excitement in them. But what is that, and what are our kids doing in the community, and what about their extracurriculars? And our kids have really, really rich lives after 3 o'clock every day. And what are we doing to honor that and to help them understand that those rich lives they have between 3 and 10 p.m. make a difference? They count, so that you're not just sitting and gaming from 3 to 10. Not that you can't learn some things from gaming, however, but those rich lives count for something.
And I think part of what we struggled with definitely early on was like, how do we measure this? And we wrestled a lot about like not feeling like teachers need to give a score or a grade on these indicators. And so the thought is more about how do we put kids in control and have them collect evidence for showing their proficiency in that, rather than the teacher marking that proficient or developing level.
Yeah, it sounds like, we've watched this portrait of a graduate unfold, and what I'm really, we've seen it unfold in Kentucky, and the districts that stay with us, I feel like inevitably find themselves to that question, Laura, which is how do we measure that? If this is what we value, how do we measure that? But I want to reinforce for the What School Could Be Academy and the whole audience that that is the unlocking question to work ourselves away from a bunch of traditional measures, is if we can start to say we value these things as much or more than we value the literacy, basic literacy stuff, and we can measure it and show kids growth on it. But it is, you're in it now. It's not, this is hard leadership work.
Well, and I think that's sometimes the problem, right? Like we're so ingrained in ACT scores or state test scores or all of these metrics that we think it has to be, we have to find an average or arrive at an outcome of a numeric score. And, prior to this, we had done some work with 40 assets. We had a long history of doing student surveys and parent surveys for a variety of, satisfaction indicators that we started taking, can we take these 3 attributes of what the students had responded, and okay, their average was this, and can we grow the average to this? And it was like we were trying to force when it didn't work, you know, like saying that, oh, this question about when I come to an unknown problem, I know what to do, it kind of falls under I'm a critical thinker. And it's sort of like we were trying to make these connections that maybe weren't there because we were so stuck on finding a data score in the way that we typically think of data in academic achievement. And so we really had to push on ourselves to be able to say, we need, if we're wanting a different outcome, we have to have a different input. And so that's kind of, I wouldn't say we figured it out, but that's kind of where we have landed now.
I think a core component of that too is, and the leaders and teachers probably get sick of hearing me say this, but who owns the data? And so I think we have got to move past the adults owning the data. And an adult owns the data when and you know an adult owns the data when kids are like, this is the grade she gave me, right? Or they blame the test or fill in the blank. Once we got to this place of like, wait a second, we don't own this data. Why are we owning the data for a kid's progress in the graduate profile? So now the question is, the kid owns the data. What are systems and structures we can put in place so a learner can watch themselves grow over time? Because, you know, like I've said to students and my own kids, I've already done high school. Okay, this is your journey. And so, but we make it our journey when we own all the data, and it's just happening to kids. So I think that's a core piece, but that's also a core belief when you're talking about competencies, right? Is who's owning it, who's in charge here.
I love that. We have two more questions. One is just looking back, you all been doing this now for what, 5 years, probably actually doing it for 3, and a lot of that during COVID. But what would you do differently now in hindsight? How would you roll this out differently? How would you envision it differently? What would change?
We have had a couple of new leaders in the past 3 years. Leaders meaning kind of bigger, more institutional leaders like school principals or a superintendent. And our superintendent came from within, so kind of was along this journey for a while. But as always, when you go through new leadership, I think it's a good opportunity to not take for granted that even those who have been on the team for a while could still perhaps use like a regrounding in the why, the what, and the how. And I think in hindsight, maybe tying that up a little bit better every time we added a new voice onto our leadership team perhaps would just, you know, keep that North Star really clear, and that kind of that graduate profile as the beacon. I think right now we are just trying to, you know, I think we kind of agree on a lot of our big rocks, but I don't know that everyone's big rock is everyone's big rock. So kind of getting that into it, what are our core 3 big rocks? And I would say across our organization, I think our leaders truly feel like the graduate profile is one of those big rocks, which is very affirming and reassuring. But as always, you want to provide the space for people to ask questions and you know, really find that entry point. I think for us at the beginning, we felt like elementary did have an entry point in this, which, you know, as a K-12 district, you know, I know many districts around the country are maybe 9-12 districts or don't have that span of K-12, but we really felt like it was valuable for our entire system to be a part of this work. And I wonder if we could have done better to continue to loop that around, you know, K through 12 through this journey.
I think I wonder about how we could have collected data from our graduates or set up systems for collecting data from our graduates to test, you know, our posits that are alive in our graduate profile. So you've been out a year at the University of fill in the blank. Which of these did you really need and which didn't? Or you've been out 5 years, or you went to the work world, or whatever. We don't do great at following up with our kids. So that's tricky. I don't have any like magic sauce for that, but maybe someone on this call who's smarter than I am can figure that out or do some doctoral work on that.
So, okay, last question for us, and then audience, we're turning to you, so get those questions ready. We have the What School Can Be Academy, a bunch of leaders in it, some leaders in the room tonight. What advice, as for a district who's just getting this work started, like what would be that one piece of advice that you'd want to give that leader as they start down this journey?
Don't work in a vacuum. I think that the biggest opportunity in really creating a profile of a graduate is talking to students. And if you don't, if it's created by a group of teachers or a group of leaders that doesn't have any voice of a student, it's awfully hard for a student to see themselves in that portrait.
That's exactly, I would say lead with your learners, let them tell your story. You know, like I said, we had way more learners at the table than we did educators. And I think because of that, we have a significantly better product. But it's easy to forget that they're only with you a short time. Like the adults hang on forever, but the kids like keep leaving you. So I also think that in this current environment, I am encouraging people leadership wise, anytime you're going to do something, invite dissenters to the table. So we all have predictable dissenters. You don't want them to outnumber, you know, friends, but don't block them out, which is part of what I think as a country on everything we've done, but in education, we've definitely done. So invite a few of the vocal minority to the table, and don't be afraid of that.
Awesome. All right, well, here's the format shift. So just opening it up now for questions and discussion. I've got a couple of folks from Kettle Moraine hanging out, so like they might like question you a little, who knows. But let's start with Jennifer or Crystal or Maria. Like, as you've been listening to Kettle Moraine and their story, what has struck you? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. I have a kind of hairy, scary question to ask. It comes from a concern over outcomes being prescribed in advance. To what degree do you, or how are you managing to make sure that this portrait of a graduate isn't something that just kids have to figure out how to fit themselves into, and how to make sure that it's something that you also fit to who they are and who walks through the doors of your school? That would be my biggest query, because I always worry. I love the predictive nature of it, and I worry that as soon as we have it written down or etched in stone, as you were saying, that suddenly it becomes any kid who can't get there doesn't belong here. So that I'm just really curious about how you're managing that.
That's a great question, Jennifer. I appreciate your thinking on that, because I think it's really easy to do that. We're a district of 98% white. The kids all look like mine, basically, right? And so a question I ask myself is are these just the values of a white upper middle class community? So I think that's a really worthy question. I think asking the question is a big piece of it. However, here's another thing. I think we have zero expectation that our kids will be proficient in each of the 6 areas by the time they graduate. And I think that that's a core piece, because I will also say when you look at that, I'm like a really experienced adult and I don't think I'm proficient in every area all the time, right? Like Laura talks about managing impulsivity. I think she's just looking at me. So, and we know none of us are all of those things 100% of the time. So the expectation that our kids are all of those things by the time they graduate is setting a kid up for failure, and it's setting the document up to be a checklist.
Awesome. I love that you're being intentional. I love the intentionality on who are we and our values capturing everyone. And I love that. I mean, it deserves more unpacking. How much of that do we expect kids to master / be proficient on? Because one thing we've run into a lot in Kentucky is like mastery of these things is really, really hard. Like impulse control, also guilty. And so, like what level of actual proficiency should we expect of that 5th grader who's ready to gateway over to middle school? Like that is, we've wrestled, I know, a lot with that. I'm assuming you probably have too.
And the flip side of that is how do we also get away from watering it down so much that's like, oh, all of the 4th graders went to Madison to the Capitol as a 4th grade field trip. So like, check, you got your engaged citizen badge or box, like, and really saying like that really isn't what this means. And so I don't know that really answers your question, but I think as Theresa had said before, I think part of our hope in building out a continuum of kind of smaller skills or attributes along that way. And to be honest, I mean, Theresa and I arm wrestled about this for a while of like, I don't know that you can get so granular that you can say the difference between a 1st grade creative and critical thinker and a 2nd grade creative and critical thinker, right? Like, do we need to think more in age bands of like a 4K through 1st grade student, a 2nd through 4th grade student, to kind of be able to honor developmental stages too, of like, you're not going to see a huge distinctive change between, one grade level. But then the other side of that is how do we make a continuum that's rich enough that it isn't just the everyone gets a trophy for going through this experience, that we're really saying like, how are you individually showing some intentional work towards being self-directed and resilient? And I'm hoping that kind of our work with building a continuum will help with that a little bit, because we haven't arrived there yet.
Well, teeing up deeper learning details, interview number 3 is a deep dive into this question of gatewaying, right? In those age bands, what does a defense look like that sort of gateways a kid from one age band to the next age band? Now that one happens to be with Francis Porter Charter, who does 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so it's not the ideal into that elementary context, but I still think there's something there. Just teasing a bit. Crystal, Maria, what questions are hitting all of you?
So I think the question that I have is, we have teachers that are so overwhelmed by all the mandates that come from the state. And I believe, Laura, you started speaking on this, but how do you shift the mindset of the teachers where it's not just one more thing that you're putting on their plates that they have to teach these kids to be able to do? Do you where are they going to find the day? Are they going to feel like it's just, this is the pendulum shifting one more time and then it's going to shift back to this? How do you overcome that with the teachers as a leader?
Yeah, it can probably speak most closely to elementary, and maybe Theresa can jump in with some secondary or middle school examples. I would say, honestly, for our teachers, it really came down to conversations around like when a family comes in for a conference in kindergarten or 1st grade, it's sort of like, yeah, I need to know if they can read and do math. But really, I want to know, do they cooperate with others? Do they get along with group time? Do other kids like them? Do they have kids that they play with and sit with at the lunch table? All of those kind of, I hate that they're called soft skills, but that social emotional look at a student is really what a parent wants their child to be successful, because that's how they come home speaking well about school, right? And so for us, giving them the language and the framework of the habits of mind was really helpful for teachers to have common vocabulary to talk about. And honestly, in elementary, the entry point for many teachers was just building that into their morning meeting, a time that they already had that kind of circle time, right when kids come in during the day, and they would talk about, a habit of the week or habit of the month that they would practice. They would connect it to, when we're reading Charlotte's Web, we're looking at the characters and we're saying like, which one of these characters is really showing that they're thinking flexibly, or which one of these characters is striving for accuracy or managing their impulsivity or not managing their impulsivity. But so for us, I mean, we fit it very tightly into like our character units in literacy, and in writing. You know, when students were writing a story, that would sometimes be their message or their theme in their story. But I didn't find that it was too much to overcome, or like the hurdle was too big for teachers to infuse it. I found more that they were eager for language to help students know how to grow in friendship, and how to grow in cooperating, and how to grow in, you know, kind of being a good learner and a good student. So it wasn't like there was a specific dedicated time of the day, you know, like, okay, now it's reading time, now it's writing time, now it's math time, now it's graduate profile time. You know, we really worked to have it be language that was just becoming part of how we help kids grow, kind of with a 360 view, rather than as a specific add-on or a specific time of the day.
That's a great
I
question.
love that. So I was just saying, I love that because that's really just like what you're doing with your social emotional learning. It's not like you just set aside time and say, I'm working on social emotional skills. It's just integrated throughout what you do all day long. And then, like you said too, it's not a checklist. You're working individually with every child where they're at in those areas. So I appreciate you sharing that.
I think at the secondary level, as well, is that we had some data that would suggest our learners who were not finishing their 4-year program that they had sought out to finish, it wasn't because they didn't know the math or the reading or the writing. It was because they didn't have those other skills. They weren't making life happen, right? And so that resonated with my high school teachers for sure. The other thing is, I'm going to go back to the teachers can't own this. They shouldn't own this. Who owns this is the kids. So while like everything else at elementary, the teachers own a lot more than the kids do, but that slow release of responsibility, the goal is that the kids are owning this towards the end.
Open room. We got time for maybe one more question.
I'll go ahead and shoot. And I'm hesitant because we're doing dinner during the first part of this, so I hope I didn't miss this. But this is Crystal, and I'm just curious, does your district use a platform or some type of management system that students use to collect evidence, display evidence, and then present that evidence as they continue through their middle school, high school experience?
Well, there is the magic question, Crystal. So we get asked that a lot, and the answer is we have nothing that we use uniformly, specifically. And everything, all the tools we do use have pluses and minuses to them, right? So we do have a tool, an internal tool that is used, that one of our directors wrote and created, a digital tool called MyLC, My Learning Collaborative. And that's probably the best tool we have for kids to collect that evidence. Outside of that, you know, we use Canvas, we use Google Classroom, we use Seesaw, but that's a weakness when kids flip from one tool to the other from their K to 12 experience.
All right, Justin, I got another then. So when you see students come to your district, let's say 6th grade, or, you know, just students that move in, how are they supported in transitioning between what a more traditional educational learning system to what you're doing within your district?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. Most of our most mature environments are multi-age, and part of our why for multi-age and what we have reinforced all the time is that kids learn how to do things by watching other kids. And that is, we don't have a teacher system for like onboarding them. We have some things in place, but frankly, the deepest system there is a multi-age environment where other kids are helping bring them along. Laura, you can probably talk more to that than I can.
Yeah, I mean, and to be very blunt, I mean, I've had students come in 4th or 5th grade that sort of like, they have to unlearn some schooling to be successful. I mean, even as basic as like, could I use this color paper or these markers to do this activity? It was like, sure, if you want, like, but realizing that they're coming from perhaps another school system or another environment where it was very much like, you get the question all the time, how long does the paper have to be? Or how many sentences do you want me to write? It's like, long enough to cover everything, short enough to keep it interesting, but for a student who was very used to being, those expectations were crystal clear, and it was like in this format, in this way, on this type of paper, in this, and that seems so crazy to be calling that out, but that sometimes was the hardest thing for kids to understand, is when you turn the choices back to them, some have a lot of anxiety and worry about that. Like, am I going to do it right? Am I going to be able to please the teacher in the same way? I would say, especially at our elementary, like we have a very, very, very low focus on the grade, the indicator that they get on their report card. But, we've also had students like, well, my grandma used to pay me $20 for every A I got on my last school report card, and you don't have alphabetic grades. It's like, nope. So sometimes it's like, it's our own structures, like the big, broad education, our own structures that get in our way. And as Theresa said, many of our environments, not only are they multi-age, but you're in KM Perform for 4 years, or you're in KM Create for 3 years, or you're in KM Explore for 6 years. It's not a one and done. It's like, it's really the power of being in the environment over time. That's part of the magic.
All
Thanks.
right. Well, speaking
Would
of,
you mind, sorry, Justin, would you
Okay.
mind putting your contact info in the chat box, so I can maybe reach out to you with some other questions?
yeah, Crystal works at the Office of Public Instruction in Montana. And as Montana gets into this space, you're going to have a lot of questions. We're going to cover a lot more ground as this unfolds, but I love that you got to see, like, this is, you got even hints there, multi-age going on, right? We've moved away from letter grades. How many things unpack as you go down this journey? Kettle Moraine is pretty far down this journey. And so there is a lot to learn from them, and we'll keep trying to bring you more of these. But Laura's point of long enough to cover everything, short enough to be interesting, we've probably reached that point. So thank you all for hanging out with us tonight and getting a little bit deeper dive on how a portrait of a graduate sort of unpacks and is led into existence from a district. So thank you, Laura. Thank you, Theresa. Jason, anything else we need to cover?
No, thank you both. We hope to get back out on the road again and might come visit you again.
Okay, appreciate it all.
Thank you all.